Welcome to the second webinar of Think Cities Earth Week, a celebration of 50 years of Earth Day. My name is Sofia Castelo, and today we'll be discussing adaptive policymaking in the age of crisis, and how can COVID-19 be pivotal in the quest for a greener planet. Our two guest speakers for today are Dr. Matt Benson, Program Director in Think City, and Dr. Shin from Penang Green Council. So, how can adaptive policymaking in the age of crisis contribute, the reactions to COVID-19 contribute to climate change policymaking? Dr. Matt Benson is an Australian geographer specialized in complex systems and human settlements. Over the past 25 years, he has been involved in a range of projects, including constructed wetlands, main street redevelopments, resettlements, big data analytics, population modeling, and national policies. He is currently a program director for Think City and is based in Penang, Malaysia. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Sofia, and thank you to the Think City Institute and to the Earth Week Organising Committee for arranging today's webinar series, or this week's webinar series, rather, and thank you for all the folks out there who are listening and watching in. So today I'll be talking about adaptive policy making in the age of crisis. So the arguments I'll be making this afternoon is that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities and contradictions of globalisation. It's an external threat. It's not an external threat, but it's actually an externality of modern industrial society. In some ways, it's an awakening for some that we live in an age of crisis. In order to respond to that, we need policy making that is flexible, adaptive, that can respond in ways not seen before. Some of the lessons that we'll take from this COVID-19 can be drawn out to adapting in the short, medium, longer term for the environmental and climate crises that we face. It also offers a moment for reflection to re-examine our place in the world. A lot of the arguments that I'm presenting today, or ideas I'm presenting today, come out of a recent paper done by myself and my colleague, Dr. Shah, from the Think City Institute. So with that, I will recognize Shah for his contribution to the material today. The first slide here is what we've all seen, which is that this exposes the globalization system, the Western democracies, in some ways are unprepared to deal with change and crisis. We've seen it in the US, and we've seen it in the UK. We've seen it in many, many parts of the world. As a result of that, we now have half of the world in lockdown or some form of confinement, and more to come. Last night, the price of oil went to negative. What that means is there is so much oil out there that they can't stop the pumping the oil, and there's not enough storage. So it means they have to pay people to take the oil. That's how much the world has been turned upside down in the last 4 weeks to 2 months. We've also seen dramatic reductions in nitrogen dioxide and pollution emissions all around the world. This is one example of Peninsula Malaysia that our team has developed last week. Very visual, very clear, the impact of mobility on pollution and air quality. We've also seen data out there that suggests that land temperatures have dropped as well. Heat island urban effect has declined in some parts. And we see innovation. In Italy, we've seen people scramble for medical equipment. We've seen people innovating. This is an article on an Italian inventor converting scuba masks to ventilators. So we've seen innovation as well amongst all of this scramble to get the health system up to standard. But the tendency has been to use the war metaphor. We're at war, it's a battle. But actually, that's only useful for a short-term threat. What is really required is a nimble, a fast, and swift response that can take feedback, that's not compromised by the strictures of a hierarchical structure, and that can listen to what people are saying, to get feedback and to flex and change as new information comes to light. If we just take the COVID-19 crisis, this is a diagram we developed that looks at how this might play out over the next 18 months. We're currently in the first peak here, coming down the edge. We're in tight restrictions. We'll move to a lower level. They'll get released. And there's every chance that, again, some of us will have to go back into a lockdown, hopefully with a lower curve, and again, into different waves of allowable activities over time. And if you think about this, even though this is for the COVID crisis, in some ways, this is what the life that we may have to live in the age of crisis. If we change the time frame here to years and decades, this is what life might look like for many of us. So we have to be able to flex in and out of these intermittent crises and respond accordingly. It could be a refugee crisis, could be bushfires, could be a tsunami or flooding or an earthquake or a nuclear meltdown. So this is an indication that we need to have what we're calling adaptive policy making. So we need to have the instruments to allow this to happen. We need to have what we're calling reflective leadership. We need to be able to communicate. We need to be able to short circuit. We need to make sure our supply chains are there. We need to make do with what is around us. We need to think about other opportunities for infrastructure and for institutions, and we need to be in sync. Let me just go a little bit through that. So what an adaptive policy instrument means? It means we have to have a risk management mindset. We need to think about the different impacts of different policies on people. We need to devolve power down to lower levels where necessary. And we need to take an institutional learning perspective to the way we approach this topic. We need reflective leadership, one that can understand complexity, can take on divergent and diverse views, and is also reflective of their own personal and social values. They must be comfortable managing top-down and bottom-up. Communicate and control. This is the opposite of command and control. This is about mobilization of society through effective communication strategies. It needs to be practical for different stakeholders. It's about building trust with local leaders so that they can then shape behavioral change. Short circuits. This is the idea that at some point in time, we might have many crises converging that could trigger a larger systemic crisis. It could spiral out of control and needs to be short-circuited. So we need to be able to, at times, reverse or come up with a different policy suddenly, fast. And we need the community to understand that and why. So effective communication is very, very important. Supply chains. Yes, this is a concept from war, but actually it works very well in peace and in times of crisis as well. This is the idea that we need to make sure that we understand the full system of supply chain, not just a part of it. We need to have resilience and redundancy in the system. And from an environmental perspective, and also to deal with crisis, we need to lower food miles, we need self-sufficiency, and we need regional priorities. Makeshifting. To makeshift something is to make do with what you have around you to solve a problem. In times of crisis, this is ever more essential. This may include, in some cases, for legislation or regulation. We have to do something fast. We don't have time. We don't have time to get it through different types of processes. We have to make do with what we have. So this is about assembling and reassembling programs and procedures, repackaging them and putting them together. It's also a mental framework reflected in other behaviors. Re-gearing is another one, second last one. Whole realities are going to change. Psychologies are going to shift. There's going to be a new norm based on new types of cultural behaviors. So institutions, assets will need to be repurposed in some cases. And we don't know exactly how they're going to function or make profit or be viable. So it'll have to be a little bit experimental. The last one is what we call orbital synchronicity. In a crisis, we need to make sure our own individual orbits are synchronized with our organizations, our working environments, and the people around us. It also means from a policy point of view that you think about institutions that may need to have orbital synchronicity. In fact, some cases, they may need to be opposing organizations. They need to be unified or synchronized under different types of arrangements. This is essential in a time of crisis. And the concept of orbital synchronicity comes from astrophysics. Astrophysics, the orbital synchronicity concept, is basically when two large bodies are moving around each other in perfect sync. For the Earth and Moon, what that means is that even though they're both spinning in different directions around one another, they always face each other. We never see the dark side of the Moon. The reason I put this image up here is this is probably considered the most influential environmental photo ever taken. It was by astronauts on Apollo 8 in 1968. It was the first time that humanity saw itself. It was the first time it saw it as one. And more importantly, in this picture, it was the first time it saw how vulnerable the Earth was. It saw it emerging from the darkness into the light. So we wonder, during lockdown, due to the COVID-19 crisis, what types of new imagery are coming out that may shape cultural norms? And I believe there are many. We saw early pictures in January of Wuhan building hospitals, ICU units in 10 days. 2 months later, the same is happening in Europe and other parts of the world. We've seen places, monuments, religious icons, which would normally have many, many people there, being transformed through lockdown. And you can see these images all around the world. We have places like Venice, which are normally buzzing with tourists, over-tourism. And this is from a festival, so a height of activity in Venice, thousands of people celebrating the spaces. And now we're getting newspaper articles showing us dolphins back in the canals. There's nobody there, with all the boats tied up. And being Australian, my favorite, we're getting images of Australia of kangaroos hopping down the street of Adelaide. So, in conclusion, the COVID-19 and climate crisis have one thing in common. They're both symptoms of a highly globalized and overly exploitative economic system. Crises are likely to increase in frequency and intensity in the years and decades ahead. And we need adaptive policy making that can offer a framework for dealing with the current and future crises. But separately, of course, we still need to continue with the long game of mitigation strategies that need to be scaled up. But maybe some of the reflections from the COVID-19 crisis will show us the benefits and possibilities of alternative behaviors. Thank you. Back to you, Sofia.
Thank you very much, Matt. Very interesting presentation. It's astounding to see the changes we've been through in such a short time frame. Now to our next speaker, Dr. Shin has over 10 years of experience in the fields of climate change, European Union-China cooperation, and sustainable development. She has significant experience in various aspects of sustainable development, including low-carbon urbanization and energy transition, green finance, climate diplomacy, and sustainable development policy for local governments. Shin has a legal background with a PhD in law, and she is currently leading the Penang Green Agenda 2030 initiative in Penang, Malaysia.
Thank you, Sofia. And big thanks to Think City and team for inviting me to the webinar this afternoon. So I will continue with Matt's presentation. Thank you, Matt, for the very interesting, insightful presentation. So I will continue your theme in terms of thinking about policymaking in the face of climate threats or shocks. The current pandemic and climate crisis have a lot of similarities, and I would say that the biggest similarity is the power to induce shocks in not just our social systems, but also economic systems. So as a result, as you presented, we need to be, policymaking needs to be more adaptive. And I would add on to that, say that yes, we need to be adaptive, but policymaking can also create certainties, more certainties in the face of uncertainties. So this is the global climate change trajectory that I got from Climate Action Tracker. So if you can see, we are currently potentially moving towards 4.8 degree increase scenario. But with our current policies, if they are properly implemented, we can perhaps keep it down to 2.8 below 3 degrees. So this is the world that we are facing at the moment. Of course, if countries step up their commitments and their actions, we might see a lesser increase in the temperature increase. But at the moment, we are looking at 2.5 to 3 sort of degrees increase over the next 50, 70 years. So that is the context why we are talking about climate risks, and because it is quite certain, even though we are sort of extrapolating out to 2100, but climate risks are, I would say, more certain than a lot of risks that our countries everywhere, actually looking at the moment, like terrorism, nuclear proliferation. I would say, compared to some of these, climate risks are even more certain because we have a lot of scientific research and findings to back up the studies. So what does it mean to Malaysia, and especially Penang, where I'm currently residing? So my colleagues, there's a team of people in PGC, Penang Green Council, actually currently looking at what are the climate threats, climate impacts in Penang. So they are collating all the review papers that have been done to see what climate change means for Penang and what are the real climate risks that we will be facing. So first of all, the impacts likely would be sea level rise. We'll have hotter days. We'll have more intense rainfalls. We will perhaps experience more storms, and we will have definitely warmer seas. So what does it mean in real life to our lives in Penang? So it could be that there will be more frequent occurrences of natural disasters like floods, drought, landslides, even heat waves, which we are currently not tracking at the moment, but it's definitely happening. We have more storms and wildfires. And in terms of food and resources, there are also a huge threats to that. So we'll be talking about flooded cropland. We'll have diseases for crops that will mean that we will lose a lot of our rice, for example, rice production. We have a water shortage. We already sort of very, very, very close to having a water shortage problem at the moment because of the lack of rain. But going forward, that problem is going to be more serious. And then we will talk about marine production. How about our fisheries? With warmer seas, with the change in biodiversity, with the change in marine ecosystems, we might be getting less and less catches from our seas. And then finally, the implication on public health. What does hotter days mean? What does more rainfalls mean? What does less crops mean? So it means we might have more diseases. We might have illnesses caused by water shortage, caused by lack of sanitation, lack of nutritious food. We have diseases caused by heat wave, air pollution, mental health, and also climate refugees. So a lot of implications, negative implications for Malaysia and Penang. So I just put up something that I think a lot of you have seen before. What does it mean for Penang in terms of losing our land to the sea in the scenario of increase of 1.5 degrees in the future compared to 2 degrees in the future? As you can see on the right-hand side, that's the 2 degree, with the 2 degree rise in global temperature, we will lose quite a large part of our land. And worryingly, if you look at the coastal areas, that's also in Seberang Perai Utara, that's also a lot of our paddy fields are at the moment. So this is not just about, it is not just fiction. This is not just something, a scary story that somebody thought of. This is something that could very really happen. So are we prepared for that? So at the moment, we are not, I would have to say, because we are talking about climate risks that are longer term. They are, that will happen not tomorrow, but over the next few decades. But our current policy making, decision making are based largely on past trends analysis. So that is one thing. And also it's very top-down and rigid decision-making process. So government has to follow a set of standard operating procedures that are made 20 years ago, some of them 15 years ago. They are not really catered for making decisions to face future crisis threats that had not happened before. And then also our policy making is not really mitigation focused in terms of reducing CO2. Yes, we have the intention. Yes, we are doing something, but it's not fast enough. And then we also have no contingency plan. What happens if pandemic strikes? Like now, we didn't have any contingency plan, not just for Penang, but the whole of Malaysia. So for a lot of things that will happen, big stuff that will cause a lot of disruptions to people's lives, a lot of time we don't have contingency plan for that. And a lot of this is because people are working in silos, departments are working in silos, so they don't talk to each other. So the Department of Flood only thinks about flood, Department of Water only thinks about water, but they don't see that if they join them up together, we can improve our water security. We can also reduce flood risks. But like I said at the beginning, I think there are ways to create more certainties through policymaking for an uncertain future. So this is something that I took from work from my previous employer called E3G. They've done this work many, many years ago. So it is about looking at how countries and nations should face and treat climate risks, because we know that the risks, some of them are quite uncertain. We don't know when they are going to happen. And when they happen, we don't know the scale of it. You know, it will have huge impact. It will have medium impact. We don't know. So there are a lot of uncertainties, but there are ways that policymakers can do to make sure that we are more prepared for this. So first of all, mitigate. Whatever we need to do, we make sure that we are aiming for the most ambitious scenario. So we should try our best. And also, very importantly, try to urge others, neighboring regions, neighboring nations, to actually work with us to strive for a lower CO2 emission future. So we should invest in transformation, about renewable energy, public transport, and also very importantly, we need to have very clear climate risk assessments for the region, for the state, for the country. And also we need to build resilience. So what does it mean? It means that yes, we should create plans to aim towards a lower CO2 emission scenario, but we have to make plans to face a higher CO2 scenarios. So we know that we will try our best to achieve this, but very likely we might not be able to achieve that in time. So we have to plan for a less good scenario. So it means that we need to have adaptation strategies for interdependent impacts. Water will impact of food will impact of health. So all these are interdependent. So we can't look at them separately, individually. So how do we prepare for this? And we need to improve regional cooperation, because Penang on its own, we can do a lot, but a lot in itself is not going to be enough to secure our security. So we need to work with a wider range of stakeholders internationally, and we need to continue to collect a robust data. And then at the same time, we need to have contingency plan for the worst case scenario. So what if something that we thought is going to happen in 50 years' time happen in a large scale in 5 years' time? So there are possibilities of that crash scenario. So we need to have contingency plan for that, and we need to have systemic monitoring of tipping points. So what are the tipping points that show that this sort of crash scenarios are coming? So if we have this in policymaking, if policymaking is directed by this, guided by this, I think the government can create more certainties in the face of uncertainty. So my last slide is, how do we do that? Policymaking for climate risks. So I think fundamentally, we, in terms of, for example, if we say Penang, we need to think about how we actually strengthen our fundamentals. Our fundamentals are the basic things that people need to survive. So we are talking about social infrastructure. We are talking about public health. We're talking about public transport, education, access to food. So there's sort of social infrastructure. But we're also talking about increasing self-sufficiency. So I'm not saying that we should close our doors and become totally 100% self-sufficient, because it is not possible given our landmass and things like that. But we can increase our self-sufficiency not only in food, water, but also on energy. How do we make sure that if the main switch in Malaysia is turned off, or there is a cut on electricity grid, can Penang survive for a few days without having to rely on grid network, the national grid networks? So what can we do to increase our self-sufficiency of energy? And so it also means the fundamentals also include increasing resilience of our business institutions, our social institutions that keep lives going. So these are the fundamentals that I'm thinking about when we say we can strengthen fundamentals and innovate for adaptation. So there are a few things that we can do in terms of policy making, and they chime very much with what Matt had said before. So forward-looking scenario planning, multi-stakeholder decision making, and also identifying key triggers for policy adjustments. So if you're talking about adaptive policy making, what are the triggers that will sort of differentiate which path you are taking. So we need to identify and monitor the key triggers, and we need to increase community resilience and self-reliance. So we need to build up on the basis of people looking after themselves through social media, through social networks. So we need to increase and encourage more of that. We need to combine top-down, bottom-up collaboration, and also we need to get that buy-in. So not just top-down leadership buy-in on this sort of tackling climate risk, but we also need to have buy-in from bottom-up stakeholders, so communities, so local governments, for example. And then lastly, we need to have continuous reviews and assessments of the the various scenarios that we are looking at, and the various possibilities, the key triggers of what we are looking for. So that's it. Thank you again to Think City for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Shin. It was a very interesting presentation. I'm sure our audience is very interested in your reference to contingency plans, because we hear, in terms of climate change, we hear a lot about mitigation and adaptation and much less about contingency plans. So I would like, at this moment, I would like to invite Matt to join us.
Hi.
For the Q&A. Welcome back. Yeah. So we already have several questions. But I would like to initiate the questions by asking Matt if you are seeing any policymakers worldwide shifting their approach to an adaptive and reflexive approach in response to COVID-19 and to broader systems in society.
Well, I think the answer is that it's a spectrum, right? We at the one end, we have Donald Trump, who seems to have a different tact every day. So that's one level of adaptable policy, which is changing your mind inconsistently every day. That's the example of how not to do it. And then probably the other end is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, which I think most of us would agree has been a standout here. And if I look at the concept we put forth, she was very early to short circuit. Yeah, she shut the country down when there was less than 100 cases, unlike anybody else. As a result of that, it looks like New Zealand is going to be one of those countries that can open up sooner rather than later. She's communicating effectively well. Command and communicate. She's on Facebook every night. She talks about language that people can understand. She talks about don't leave your bubble. If people ask her questions about can I go for a walk in the forest? She says yes, you can, as long as you don't leave your bubble, your family bubble. And I think also very reflective. So I think that's probably the best example of adaptive policy making, at least in the sense that we can find it that I can think of. And of course, there's others in the rooms from Canada to France as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're having many questions, so I'm just going to follow up with one question related to this one, which is how do we include community in as part of adaptive policy making? From Daniel Mahadzid.
Well, I think, as I presented there, you need leaders that can lead by top down and bottom up. That's the first thing. So you need to have leaders in place that can understand the value of having communities involved in the process. I think there are examples in Kerala that Jomo has mentioned many times. That the way in which they've engaged with community on a different level, it's very much the opposite of a top-down command and control type approach. This is the command and listen type approach. We actually, because we don't know, there are a lot of things we don't know. So there's no question that that's the key. One of the challenges that we face at the moment is that it's quite difficult to get to community. We're having our own experiences with engaging with community in PPRs, just because of the nature of physical distancing that's necessary. It's very hard. So we ourselves need to be a bit flexible in the way that we engage with communities. We need to come up with new ways, digital ways, as well as, there still needs to be some physical presence. We still need to show a face in a practical and safe way. So possible, but needs some innovation.
Mm-hmm. Shinwei, there's a question here coming up. Climate activists have been asking, they've been demanding changes in policy for decades now, and yet they have achieved very little progress. We see emissions rising every year. I think probably the only exception will be 2020. So which new policies do you think can effectively bring change in terms of climate mitigation?
Thank you, Sofia. I think emissions rise in certain countries. In certain countries, they have been reduced. So we are talking about not just one form of development, one pace of development. There are several paces of development in the world. You know, there are countries who are already so advanced that they don't need fossil fuel at all. There are countries that are still having to rely on fossil fuel. So I think we can't just look at the big picture and say that nothing is working. Things are working. You know, in certain European countries, the emissions have come down, and even certain states in the US, the emissions have come down. So you do see good results from certain countries, not necessarily all just from first world countries, but you know, in developing countries, good stuff already been done. Like Costa Rica, you know, they have 100% renewables, for example, renewable energy. So I think we need to look at it for different paces. How far can people go, and what are the things that would work for a certain region or certain countries? So I would think the major sort of factors that influence CO2 emission would be, like, if you're talking about energy systems, if you are talking about food security, if you're talking about, you know, how we do our industry, circular economy. So these are big concepts that can be implemented. Might be different ways, different pace, but across the world. So I think the traction is there, especially with the EU Green Deal, the new Green Deal by the EU. That could be a game changer if they impose like a carbon border tax, which means that, you know, everywhere else, if you want to export to EU, you need to up your games. So things like that, I see that, you know, there are improvements. Might not be fast enough because of various reasons, you know, political reasons, interest capture reasons. But there are things, you know, whether we can achieve gradually. So I agree, it's quite a pessimistic future, but I also acknowledge that a lot of things have been done and can be done.
Thank you. We have a question from Robert. Are either of the speakers optimistic that we will see the emergence of reflexive leadership, given the embedded systems in global politics? And do you favor a policy of no growth or degrowth?
Maybe I'll take that to start. I'm actually quite optimistic about it, to be honest. I mean, I know it's going to be difficult, and it could go either way. It could go down, it could go the opposite way. But I think momentum is with more of a reflective type approach. I think, as Shinwei pointed out, I think the Green Deal is an example of a possible new future. So I do see some very positive things that are likely to happen. On the no growth versus negative growth, well, we're seeing negative growth. I think for me, it's not about growth or not growth. It's about changing the yardstick. Yeah, it's about what do we actually measure progress by. Now, if that means that businesses need to thrive in order for people to sustain a livelihood, then that's what we need to measure. But do we need to measure a percentage GDP growth by nation as the primary indicator of success? Probably not, would be my answer.
I would just add to that, in terms of reflexive leadership, I'm less optimistic because I think human beings, we have short-term memories. Unless you actually institutionalize the new way you operate, then if it's just relying on what we are doing now, knee-jerk, reactions because of this, we are introducing short-term policies to address that. So I think if that is the case, if these are not institutionalized, I don't think, I think people will forget about it quite quickly. But pandemic, it's different. Yes, I think it will have some changes, but in terms of dealing with things other than coronavirus, I don't know. I'm less optimistic. And in terms of growth, what's the, whether degrowth, unfortunately, I can't really answer on that because I'm not economist. And also, I think this situation is pretty unprecedented. So I can't really comment on that.
if I might just add to that, my comment is this, which is that historically, pandemics have been the great times of cultural shift. That's what happens. Crisis begets change.
Exactly. We don't exactly know how this change will be. That's definitely a definite point. So we have another question that we can influence the outcomes. Right? We have a question. In what ways can we use COVID-19 as a gateway to institutionalize this kind of adaptive policy making in our respective organizations? Any tips we can take action on, say within the next 3 to 6 months?
Shall I try?
Go for it,
in Penang, we have been, as part of the Penang Green Agenda, we have been proposing to the state to set up a dedicated disaster management unit, because this is the findings of our working group on disaster management, and we found that there are a lot of gaps and holes, and that the system is quite reactive. So we have been pushing for it, and I think COVID-19 could provide the impetus for the state to actually to push certain stakeholders to recognize that there are holes in this, or to strengthen our disaster management system. That also includes planning for climate risks. So we really hope that at least in terms of disaster management, there could be some positive moves. And in terms of other sort of systems or other elements that would be really important for resilience towards climate risk, I think something like food security is something that the state government is really looking at. I think everywhere in the world, people are already looking at that. So I think there are elements that can be pushed forward because of COVID. I'm pretty optimistic on those few elements. Thank you.
I'll just add something quickly, because the question was about from an organizational perspective, if I recall correctly. So I would think that an organization would want to have its own reflections, right? It would want to be thinking about what have we learned, what contradictions of our organizations have emerged as a result of this, and how can they be readjusted, etc. So that would be one. What additional redundancies do we need to build in to be more resilient as an organization? So it's probably a question of asking questions to the organization and thinking about also the opportunities that might be out there. Do some scenario planning, start thinking about, there's not going to be one future. There are many possibilities. So some of them will be in your favor, some of them may not be. And also think about things like, something more practical. We've all learned, I know our organization has learned to do webinars very fast. So that might be something that we take forward further. So what are the lessons that we've learned here that can actually be opportunities into the future would be my comment.
Yeah, that's actually related to another question from D. Kumar. Do we need to change our approach in policy making? And can we adopt certain practices developed during the MCO, such as working from home, limited travel? Limited travel would certainly impact climate change mitigation. So do you think that there will be some continuity to some practices developed during this MCO?
Okay, so the question, I guess, has two elements. One is about policymaking, how policymaking will change, and the other thing is how social changes will perhaps take shape, whether to become more permanent. I don't know, maybe I will take a stab at the first one in terms of changes in policymaking. I think in my presentation, I sort of ran through a very short list of, well, not short, but list of problems that we have with policymaking at the moment. So, and because of these shortcomings, any crisis, any shocks will amplify the results of these inadequacies. So we hope that, if we can do the opposite of these shortcomings in policymaking at the moment, we can get to a better place sooner. In terms of social changes, I don't know, Matt, you want to comment on that?
Well, again, like I said, pandemics are the great historic and big mega converging crises, shall we say, have always been the moments when the biggest cultural shifts have happened. And we still practice things today from pandemics from many, many years ago. Yeah. So, but the honest answer is we don't really know. I wrote a piece about 3 weeks ago saying, is the handshake dead? Yeah. Will we ever shake hands again? Well, that depends, right? If it disappears in 2 weeks, then maybe we will. But if it takes 5 years, maybe it might take a while before we all shake hands again. So these sorts of things we need to be thinking about. Yeah. And why do we shake hands in the first place? We shake hands because we don't have a weapon.
Exactly.
Is that a culture that we need to have in the future? Maybe not.
I think social changes will drive changes in policy making as well. So it could go the other way. If people start to request for more working from home, then our policies on perhaps, I don't know, transportation and subsidies and things like that will need to change.
I think we just need to be mindful of the negative consequences or unintended consequences of some of our behavior as well. I imagine when we all go back to work suddenly, that some of us won't be using public transport so much, as an example.
For sure, definitely. Shin, I'm very interested in something you talked about. You mentioned contingency plans. Okay, this question is a bit tricky. So how far do you think we should go in terms of contingency plans? I would like to just quote an article that came out in Nature magazine early this month, which estimates as the time for the first ecosystem breakdown to happen before 2030 in tropical oceans, and then be extended to tropical forests, and then reach higher latitudes by 2050. So we're talking here about a scenario of food chain collapse, breakdown and collapse. So what kind of contingency plans could we develop in such a scenario? First of all, I'm not really a scientist, so I can't really tell with full authority that that's a scenario that you need to really take into account and vice versa. But what I can say as a layman and as someone who advises on policy making, I would say, look for the scientific consensus. Even if it's really out there, but if there is consensus, then don't discount it. Right? If that is the consensus that we are heading that way, not just in terms of climate change, but biodiversity, like you said, biodiversity loss that will start a chain of reaction in our food security, on our food chain. So that sort of things, I think it's really up to the government to get the best scientific advice it can get. I think it's pretty available right now with IPCC, with all these scientific community. They're coming up with findings and they share them widely. So the government can actually easily get access to this information, but then it has to make a decision in terms of what sort of contingency plan, a scenario it has to look at. Once that is sort of taken, once that decision is taken, whether they will look at really worst case scenario, it's really, really bad, but there is a chance that it might work, then you really have to face the reality that this is the contingency that we need to work on. And how do you do it? I think it would require more than just what Penang can do, what Malaysia can do. First of all, there has to be a global effort, right? For example, some people have suggested that the UN should have a climate risk institution, someone within the body of UN to actually take on the responsibility to assess climate risks and provide a report to all nations about what are the risks that we are facing now and how they change it. So there has to be some sort of global effort that put in money to carry out R&D, to do assessments, and to carry out actions. And then at another level is regional cooperation. Like I said, Penang can't do it itself, Malaysia can't do it itself. There has to be coordination between within the region. So the region in Asia, in ASEAN, the actions that they might take, the priorities that they might have will be different from the region in Latin America, for example. So regional collaboration needs to identify areas and measures that they are very important for them. And then down to the local level, Malaysia, Penang level, yes, we have to prepare ourselves. And we also have to sort of weigh with the resources we have
right? So we have to emphasize working internationally, so outsource a lot of the things that regional body, international body can do. But internally, we need to make sure that we strengthen our fundamentals. Again, the basic things that we will need to have to ensure that we have a stable society or livable society in the face of a sudden crisis.
Thank you very much. We have another question for both. Can policy change from Gwyn? Can policy change with the same policy makers in place?
Sorry, would you mind repeating that?
The question comes from Gwyn.
Yes.
Can policy change with the same policy makers in place? Or is it possible for new policies being developed by old politicians?
Well, I think that's the thing about crisis, right? Yeah, people reflect who they are. They reflect what their values are. Some of them are going to have to make decisions they're going to have to live with for the rest of their life. Yeah, some doctors have had to make decisions that they'll have to live with the rest of their life. Yeah, so I mean that's the thing about crisis is that it changes the nature of leadership is the point I think I would make. Now some will be really effective, like Jacinta, and outstanding on a global stage in terms of the way that her persona is, and some will be completely opposite that we've seen, and some will rest somewhere in between. So I don't think it's a simple answer as toss the old out, and replace the whole system. I don't think we want a revolution, quite. Maybe it needs to be more progressive, a more slow, well not slow, but more hard push systemic shift. Yeah. Over a period of 12 to 3 years, you may actually be able to swing some of these policies towards something that's a little bit more aligned or attuned to climate change and environmental issues and social injustice, etc.
Okay, very interesting question. In some countries, we have seen how authoritarian governments have taken advantage of the lockdown, increased surveillance and monitoring to control their citizens. What are your thoughts on the tug of war between security versus privacy and freedom?
Jinwei, you don't want to, you're a lawyer?
I've never been a lawyer. I did law, but never been a lawyer. But I have my personal thoughts. I think it really depends on the social contract between the state and the people, and also cultural differences. So what do you define as essential freedom might not be the same from country to country. So I think if you're talking about autocratic, authoritarian government, then the starting point is already not good, right? It's authoritarian because the people have no choice. So the social contract is imposed one-sided. So the government is saying that we are doing this. So most of the time, the citizens can't do anything. Then of course, it's bad if there's no choice. But in certain semi-authoritarian, maybe a little bit autocratic, but still there's democracy. I think it really it depends on the social contract between the state and the citizen. We can't say that, all infringement is wrong. I think it really comes down to, if you're talking about democracy, is what the people want.
It seems as if we're having a little bit of a technical difficulty.
I'm back.
Sofia, are you there? Okay.
Yeah, I had an internet issue, which I believe Sofia did as well.
Apologies.
Yeah.
I'm back on.
Hi, Duncan.
Apologies for the technical problems. Okay, so an interesting question came up regarding the oil prices coming down. This is very surprising, but how will this impact climate change mitigation efforts after the crisis? Because everyone will want to use, to buy as much as oil before the price goes up.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's actually gone into negative. The economists have been predicting it for several weeks. So effectively what it means is they're paying you now to use oil. Yeah, that's what it means. Right?
Exactly.
So that in itself is a bit of a dangerous idea, I would think. But that's obviously not sustainable for very long. So I imagine the contradictions of that policy initiative or that action will reveal itself in time. That's my. You can't keep on paying people to use oil indefinitely, right? When it's costing you, where you're getting the money from. Eventually, your wealth is going to disappear, and the very foundation of what your wealth is built, you destroy in the process. So I imagine that that's just a temporary stopgap or a short circuit from their point of view, to at least allow the system to continue, the flow to continue, until they figure out how to get it back for them on track.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, good point. So just one final question. Some key players for both of you, please. Some key players in climate change policy are now saying that incremental change is no longer enough to achieve necessary goals and that we need systemic change. What do you think is necessary to trigger systemic change?
Pandemic. usually a crisis.
Excellent reply.
I think usually people are complacent.
And hopeful reply.
No, I think usually
but
people
very hopeful.
Yes, I once asked when I was doing my master's in the UCL, and I once asked our lecturer, and he is a very well-known international environmental lawyer, and he represented countries, and we asked him, so what would bring about that change? And his answer was, unfortunately, crisis, because people are complacent, and only in crisis people start to, like Matt said, rethink, reflect, and innovate, I think.
My answer would be threefold. Yes, I can hear you. My answer would be threefold. Okay? My first answer would be that we need to have conversations. We need to develop a meta narrative about what the new future looks like. Now, I know some of us may have it, but we need to bring a range of institutions along with that story. So it's about developing a story, and it needs to be embedded into culture in different ways, in very subtle ways. My colleague Celia Leong, next week or this week or next week, is having a conversation with students in Hungary and Johor at the same time around her maps of changes in nitrogen dioxide and why that is the case. I think this is the story. So telling stories, having narrative, engaging, that's the first one. The second one is kind of what I mentioned before about thinking about our own learnings, accelerated learnings, thinking about the behaviors that have changed that we can see ourselves through maps and other such things, and think about how we might be able to apply them in the future. That's at a very individual level. And then at an organizational level, I think that there is if you're a business or organization, there are opportunities out there to re-gear whole institutions, to re-gear assets, to think about how cruise liners might be used in different ways, how buildings might be used in different ways. So I think there are opportunities, because it's such a vacuum, the idiosphere is such a vacuum at the moment, that those who can move fast and re-gear those institutions and spaces, I think can lay the foundations for more than just incremental change, and something more akin to what we might call systemic change over a period of several years.
Thank you very much, both. We end on this very hopeful note. Thank you, Dr. Matt, Dr. Shin Wei.
Thank you.
Thank you all for participating in the webinar.